Alright, so today we're going to be talking about Albert Einstein. We're not going to be talking about the Einstein part as much as we're going to be talking about the Albert part, because there's enough videos on the Einstein part where if you want to go do that research, you can go do that. But I want to know more about Einstein as a person, so we're going to cover a lot more of that in this video than anything else. In 1876, Hermann Einstein and Pauline Koch married in union. Yay. They would have their first child a few years later in 1879, March 14th, 1879 to be specific. And that child's name was none other than Albert Einstein. In 1880, 1 year later, his family would up and move to Munich, Germany. And the following year, in 1881, his sister Maria was born. After moving to Munich, Albert's father Hermann and Albert's uncle would end up starting this manufacturing company that manufactured electrical equipment based off of direct current. And if you don't know what direct current is, that just pretty much means that current flows in one direction and not the other direction. So think of it as like a one-way street pretty much. That's an easy way to think of it. At the age of 5, Albert would attend a Catholic school. You gotta remember, he was Jewish. I don't know if this was a common thing for Jewish to attend Catholic school, but you'd have to let me know. I know when I was in like preschool and kindergarten, I was in Catholic school, but I was Catholic at the time, so it was different. I don't know. You'd have to let me know on that one. At the age of 8, he transferred to Loophole Gymnasium, which would later be renamed Albert Einstein Gymnasium, because that's what bosses do. They just have stuff named after them. And this is where he would receive his advanced primary and his secondary education. You gotta remember too, he excelled at physics and mathematics at a really early age. He even taught himself algebra, calculus, Euclidean geometry. And at the age of 12, he even discovered the original Pythagorean theorem. And like I failed calculus when I was 18, so I got no idea what a lot of that means, and I couldn't even tell you. I couldn't even go into depth with it even a little bit if I wanted to. So it's needless to say that this guy is like out of this world smarts, right? He would even go on to say that he mastered integral and differential calculus at the age of 14. And I don't even know what the difference between those two are. So good for you. And I'm 35. In 1894, at the age of 15, his family up and moved to Italy. First, they moved to Milan. I mean, that sounds fancy. I like to go to Milan. And then they went to Palazzo Coronazzi. I don't really know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it. But he would stay behind with the intentions of finishing out of secondary school, but that's not the way it would really play out. He wasn't a fan of their learning policy. And because of that, he said that it lacked people to be creative. So he would actually end up dropping out of secondary school and reuniting with his family in Palazzo Coronazzi later that year in December. Now his family had to move because his father and his uncle's company didn't end up going too well. They had a big contract that they were going to secure to switch the DC current to AC current, and AC current, alternating current, just means that it goes in one direction and the other direction, unlike DC that just goes in one direction. But the thing is, they didn't have the capital that they needed to update all their equipment in order to do so, so the deal fell through. They didn't get it. They had to sell their manufacturing company in Munich, and that's why they moved to Italy in the first place. In 1895, he would go on to take the entrance exam for the Federal Polytechnic School in Switzerland, which is a school that specializes in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And you gotta remember, he didn't even finish secondary school at this time. But he didn't pass this exam. Like, yeah, he did really good on the mathematics and physics portion, but he failed the other portions of the exam, so he wasn't admitted entrance into the school at this time. Instead, the principal of the school recommended that he went back to secondary school and finish out his schooling, which he took his advice, and a year later he finished secondary school. In 1896, he would renounce his German citizenship because it was common at that time for people of that age, so they had to join the military. It was mandatory. And he didn't want to join the military. He wasn't about that life. He was like, I want to use my brain, not my body. So he renounced his German citizenship so he didn't have to join the military. And also later that year, he re-enrolled in the Polytechnic School for their 4-year mathematics and physics teaching program. And in that program, there were 5 other freshmen taking that course. And out of those 5 freshmen, only one of those freshmen was a woman. Not just any woman. It was Mileva Mariak. Mariak? I don't really know. We're just going to call her Mileva. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce her first name. But we're going to rock with that one. And Albert was quickly fascinated with Mileva, and they would soon bond over their shared interests in mathematics and physics. And not too long after that, they would become lovers. Lovers laying down Einstein way. In 1900, Albert graduated and was finally able to teach his beloved mathematics and physics. Only issue with that is he spent 2 years trying to get a teaching job and couldn't get one. So in late 1901, he took a job at the Swiss Patent Office as the Assistant Examiner 3. I don't know if 3 is better than 2 or better than 1 or worse than 2 or worse than 1, but either way, that was his job title. And me personally, I think that would be fun to be at a patent office and you get to see all these different ideas come through the door and you're the first one that gets to lay his eyes on them and see them. I think that'd be an awesome job. For me personally, I think I would love it. Something different every day. Also this year, he would gain his Swiss citizenship. In 1902, Albert and his friends decided to create a group that they called the Olympic Academy, where they would just get together and talk about science and philosophy. Which just sounds like just a bunch of friends getting together and they put a name on it, really. I mean, me and my friends did the same thing when we were kids, right? Every 15th of every month, we would go out and eat Chinese food because that's what we loved. We weren't about the science and philosophy, but we were about that Chinese food. We call ourselves the 15th crew because we just thought it was cool at the time. To me, that's just what this Olympia Academy sounds like, just a bunch of friends getting together. Also that year, though, Mileva would go to visit her family in Serbia. And she would do this because Albert and Mileva, they weren't married and she was pregnant. And having a baby out of wedlock at that time was a big, big no-no. So she went to go visit her family to give birth to this baby, right? This is their one and only daughter they ever had, Lizrael. I don't really think that's how you pronounce that name, but that's as close as I'm going to be able to get. So she had their daughter, and shortly afterwards she would return to Albert in Switzerland. But there's not much known about their daughter. I mean, it's thought to believe that her parents took care of her only for a year or so, because it's thought to believe that she contracted scarlet fever and ended up dying just a year later. So that's the story anyway. Whether that's true or not, nobody really knows. There's stories that she was adopted, that this happened, that happened, but the scarlet fever thing, that's the closest in history we're ever gonna really get. And shortly after returning home, Mileva and Albert would be married. And what's important to remember too, not really for any future scenario, I just think it's interesting that Albert's family did not like Mileva at all. They're like, you're too good for her and all this stuff. And Mileva's family didn't like Albert at all. They're like, yeah, this guy's no good for you. So their families just hated each other, really. And they did it anyway. So I kind of like that. I kind of respect that. But they felt that way because they weren't from the same country. So they felt like they were outsiders and they shouldn't be meshing together. In 1904, they had their first son now, Hans Albert. And they would have one more child together in 1910. And his name would be Edward. Or Edouard. Or however you want to say it. But either way, he doesn't come up. Neither one of them really come up in the story too much. Edouard will come up later, but you pronounce it how you want to. Between 1900 and 1905, Albert would go on to write and publish several papers, including in 1905 his famous special theory of relativity. E equals mc squared, which is the most famous equation we all know him for. We're not going to go too much in depth as far as the mathematics and scientific side of his things. Other than that, just thought that was a note to bring up because it was a pivotal thing in his life, and that's something we all remember when we think of Einstein. In 1906, he was finally awarded, I don't want to say finally, but he was awarded his PhD. And 2 years later, in 1908, he secured a junior teaching job at the University of Bern in Germany. No, it's in fucking Switzerland, son of a bitch. But just a year later, in 1909, this guy named Alfred Kleiner, he created this associate professor job at this university for Albert. After hearing one of Albert's lectures, he was like really inspired. He was like, I got to get this guy working for me. So he created this position just for Albert. He accepted this job, and in 1911, he was promoted to full professorship after he accepted a chair in the German Charles Ferdinand University in Prague. The move, though, would require him to become an Austrian citizen. So he's just becoming a citizen everywhere. You know, he's been a citizen of Germany, and then he renounced that, became a citizen of Switzerland, and he's a citizen of Austria. So this guy's getting around. In 1912, though, he moved back to Germany to take up this chair in theoretical physics at his alma mater. This is also the year he would begin an affair with Elsa Lowenthal, who was actually Albert's first cousin on his mom's side, and not only that, right? It was his second cousin on his dad's side. Now, I don't know how y'all feel about that, but I'm just going to keep my opinions to myself. In 1913, he was offered a position at Humboldt University, and this would be able to give him the freedom to pursue his research, but without the burden of having to teach, so he could just spend all of his time dedicating to just researching. And he was making a decent salary, so he was like, yeah, sure, I'll totally take that. I don't got to do this, but I can do what I love to do. So he jumped on that opportunity right away. But soon after taking this opportunity, his wife, Maliva, she found out that Albert was kind of having a little affair going on with his cousin. So she wasn't too happy about this. She was so not happy about this. She took the kids and moved back to Zurich, and she's like, yeah, have fun with that one. And unfortunately, like Albert's two greatest passions in his life was his work in mathematics and physics and women. And he didn't really spend much time on much else, and that includes his kids. So after his kids, you know, she took his kids, he wasn't really around in their lives too often after that, which is I'd like to say unfortunate, but maybe he just wouldn't have made a good father, you know, so maybe it was for their best interest. In 1919, Maliva and Albert were finally granted the divorce after being separated for 5 years. And I find this part of the story funny, like super funny and super like, I don't know if I would have done that, you know, hindsight being 2020. Part of his divorce settlement was if he should ever win, you know, the Nobel Prize, what he would do is he would take whatever finances, you know, he got and received from the Nobel Prize, and he would give it to his ex-wife. And just 2 years later, guess what happens? You know, guess what happens just 2 years later? Guess who wins the Nobel Prize? That's right, Albert. And he received for that Nobel Prize at that time. You got to remember, at that time in the early 1900s, he received $31,000. Yeah, $31,000. Which in today's, for accounting for inflation for today, that's worth over 530 grand. Can you imagine? You just reached like this pinnacle of your career. You got this Nobel Prize you've been working for, and you gotta like take $500,000 and now give it to your ex-wife because you promised her 2 years ago. Now in 1923, Albert's gonna do what Albert does, right? And what does Albert do best outside of math and physics? Women. So he started another affair, right, with his secretary. And it wasn't just his secretary, it was one of his close friend's nieces, too. They started having an affair together. Her name was Betty. Not Betty Crocker, but Betty Newman. Yeah, I don't know Betty Newman. I don't know much of us that knows Betty Newman. And when Elsa found out about this affair, she didn't do what Maleva does and take off and left. She was like, yeah, okay, that's what you're gonna do. Either way, I'm gonna be loyal to you to the end. And you know what? She was loyal to him to her dying day. So good for her. Good for her. Or good for him. Really? I don't really know. Guess it depends on which side of the fence you're on. In 1933, he kind of realized he couldn't return back to Germany because of like the whole rise of the Nazi regime thing going on, and the whole new Hitler, Adolf coming into power and all this stuff. So being like, from a family of Jews, he realized it probably wouldn't be a good idea to return back to Germany. He would stay in Belgium, he would stay in Norfolk, England, and eventually he would end up in Princeton, New Jersey, where he accepted an offer from the Institute of Advanced Studies as a residential scholar. I don't know what a residential scholar is, but it don't really sound like you do a whole lot, to be honest with you. And in 1935, he would apply for U.S. citizenship after just deciding he was just going to stay in the U.S. now. So this guy, he had citizenship in Germany, and then he renounced that. Then he had citizenship in Switzerland, and then he had citizenship in Austria. And oh yeah, by the way, he did get his citizenship back in Germany, back when he was like, teaching and doing his stuff in Germany. And then he renounced that again, when this whole World War, stuff's going on, and, the whole Nazi thing. So he renounced Germany twice. And now he's applying for his U.S. citizenship. So this guy he is a citizen of the world, my friends. Now, unfortunately, that year too, in 1935, he ended up marrying Elsa, right? And Elsa would be diagnosed with heart and kidney problems. And unfortunately, she wouldn't make it much past her diagnosis. She would pass away the following year in 1936. Now, don't think this stopped Albert from having fun, because if you know Albert's going to have fun, especially when it comes to, the women. So he was listing a bunch of women that he had spent the evening with, including one lady named Margarita Kovalikov, who was the wife of this Russian sculptor, Sergei Kovalikov, who actually created a bronze bust statue of Albert for the Institute of Advanced Studies that he was working at. So this dude makes a sculpture of this dude, and then the dude he makes a sculpture, the sculpture does his wife. What the? I mean, come on, that's kind of messed up. But Albert's Albert. He's gonna do what he does. Now we got to go back for a second to his youngest son, Eduardo. Now, Eduardo, around the age of 20, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he would spend the rest of his life between his mother's care and spending temporary care in asylums, kind of going back and forth. So, unfortunately, Eduardo didn't end up doing too well. Now, in 1939, right before World War II, Einstein learned that Germany was trying to develop the atomic bomb. And he knew that if they did this, they were going to use this. So he would write letters to Roosevelt and have meetings with Roosevelt saying like, hey, Germany's on this kick that they're going to develop this atomic bomb. So I highly suggest that you get on this before they do and figure it out before they do, or else it might not go nicely. And Roosevelt would take this advice and start the Manhattan Project. And funny thing is, Einstein wasn't even allowed to be a part of the Manhattan Project. Not that I think he wanted to, because I don't think he really wanted to, but despite not being allowed to be a part of this Manhattan Project, it was still his formula equals MC squared that really discovered everything for it. I mean, that was the catalyst to creating the atomic bomb, which I think is insane. Now, unfortunately, though, Albert would say that this was his one great mistake in life. was suggesting that they go down this endeavor. Because Albert was very much a pacifist at the time. Well, he was just very much a pacifist in general. He saw war as a disease. He didn't want any part of war. So thinking that he had something to do with a bunch of people dying because he wrote down a letter and convinced the president to do something, he didn't feel real good about this. So he said that was his one big great mistake in his life. In 1940, he was finally granted citizenship of the United States of America. And he would also go on and like join the NAACP, and he fought for African American civil rights and be a part of all that movement. But I think that's like got a bit of irony to it, because yeah, he was fighting for African American civil rights, but he was also like kind of really prejudiced at the time, especially towards like Asian people. So I guess like, yay, civil rights as long as you're not Asian. Now, in 1955, he ended up in the hospital. He had surgery done a little bit ago, but it didn't end up holding up, and he started to suffer from internal bleeding. He refused surgery this time, though. His words were, "It's tasteful to prolong life. It is my time to go." And those are going to be the last words we're ever going to know him as saying, because one day later, on April 17th, 1955, he would pass away. And granted, he did say something right before he passed away, but he said it in German, and the nurse wasn't German, so she had no idea what he says. So really, his last words are going to be lost in history forever. So at least those are the last English words we know he said, right? But to finish out this story, in 1976, Albert Einstein's house was now made a National Historic Landmark. So, who was Albert at the end of the day? Yeah, Albert was a genius who published a ton of papers and did a bunch of great research to stuff that we still find prevalent today. Yeah, he was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, but he was also a prolific lover who couldn't stay faithful to his wives. He was also a father who was never there for his kids. You know, he was also someone that would stand up for racism while also being racist at the same time. So who was Albert? I guess that's for you to decide. But this is the Albert side of Einstein. So I hope you enjoyed the history of Einstein. Until the next video where I'll see you there, don't forget, take care.